All right, fine, outlets. This is the Steve Droid once more on the Thrillcast. I'm joined for this ongoing series talking to comics critics and journalists by a fantastic podcaster who you may have read his articles, but you more likely may have seen and heard him from his podcast, Comic Book Couples Counselling. Brad Gullickson is on the show today. Brad, how are you?
I am wonderful. Thank you for having me.
It's amazing to have you on the show. I'm really glad that you were able to join us. You've been a real advocate of 2000 AD, especially over the last few years. And I did speak to Lisa, your co-podcast host, and I didn't mention this to her. But for yourself, what was the 2000 AD stuff that you first started with out of interest?
Oh, I think it was probably the Batman Dredd comics of my youth. That was probably where I encountered Dredd first, although it might have been the Sylvester Stallone movie, which I was absolutely in love with as a kid. And the Judge Dredd film, I don't know how long it's been since you've seen that masterpiece, but it opens with a credit sequence, a title sequence over a series of Judge Dredd comics. And I remember seeing those comics. I was like, hey, hold on. I like comics. This is based on a comic. I need to go get those comics. And so the combination of Batman Dredd, the first one, and the Judge Dredd movie, that propelled me into, Mega City 1 and the Cursed Earth.
Which is so appropriate because this is where we're heading towards with our episode today. Because you've picked a comic which has a very brief introduction to Mega City 1 and then abruptly leaves it forever. What's the comic you picked today?
So I picked the Helltrekkers from John Wagner and Alan Grant, José Ortiz, and Horacio Lalia. I had never read this book before, but Lisa and we went to C2E2 in Chicago, and unfortunately Lisa got incredibly sick and we had to cancel that con. And we basically spent most of Chicago just wandering around. And in the last day before we left, Lisa was feeling better. Nobody was testing positive for anything terrible. So we went to a couple comic book stores, and I went to Howling Pages in Chicago, and they had this featured prominently on their new release shelf. And I was intrigued by it. And the concept is just so good. This kind of like wagon train through the cursed earth. It's like, that sounds right up my alley. I like Westerns. I like the Cursed Earth. Let's check that out. And only last night did I actually read this and love it, but also go, my gosh, is this depressing? Oppressively depressing, but in the best way.
I was like, I have spoken to Brad in the past. And Brad is not the personality I would think would be like, oh, this is exactly my thing. I want to read this. It's really bleak. It's really depressing. The ending's a bit of a bummer. And then to hear you now, so excited and pumped to talk about this one. It is so interesting to me because I really want to go into like the details of this story, which goes into some of the darkest places I think I've seen in any comic, let alone a 2000 AD comic.
Yeah, like I actually think like, you mentioned how Mega City 1 appears briefly, and we have like the gate judge in the beginning, send off this rad wagon train and say like, it's pretty bad out there. You might want to think about sticking around here. And Rudd, the wagon train leader, the rad wagon leader, says, it's better to die in the cursed earth than live in Mega City 1. And then you go through all these days of just pure torment on these people. And like immediately people are dying. We're losing rad wagons. And for me, what it does is it sells how much of a hellscape Mega City 1 must be if this is the alternative. At
one point, I think they say it's better to die in hell than remain in Mega City 1.
That's it. That's the line. Yes.
Like there's several times they repeat the line in different ways, but like every time it hits home and you go, oh, I just remember what they're getting away from. Because they've, at this point, this was published in around 1984, I believe. That's when it first came out. So Mega City 1's had its fair share of dire straits in the time it's, tragedy started. But this, like the desperation to get away from it is such an interesting choice, because you think John Wagner, Alan Grant, the two guys who are more familiar with Dredd than most other names you can think of, for them to go, we know this is bad, we know this is tough, we know, what do we want to do? I know what they want to do. They want to get away. Let's do that story. Let's do the story of the escape. It's such an interesting choice, I think, from those creators.
Yeah, and it is sad because so many people die right from the jump, but there is also tremendous action in this comic, some incredible creatures and deadly concepts that you encounter on the trail. And with all of that, too, is a perverse comedy that 2000 AD does so well. And, even though I'm going like, oh, my God, you're also at times going like, you're really chuckling if you're not full on laughing like I was.
I mean, there's a point in particular I want to talk about with that. Let's just to people who've not read the story so far, this is so Helltrekkers is the story of 111 people who decide that Mega City 1 is too much for them. They want to leave, and so they get in their rad wagons in a convoy, and they decide to go across the cursed Earth, which is the nuclear wasteland that resides just outside of Mega City 1. And so this is a story of people in a convoy trying to get from one side of America to the other side in one piece. But it is not safe out there, to say the least. And these people have never met each other before. They're not used to each other before. They've got to try and get along internally amongst the different wagons and get through all the dangers that the Cursed Earth provides. So there is human drama, there is sci-fi drama, there is so much different stuff that every page of this comic has 7 different disasters on it at once. It just goes immediately from bad to the worst time imaginable.
And when I was initially reading it last night, I was like, oh, we're starting with like the dinosaur threats, right? We go like almost immediately to the tyrannosaurs. And I was like, well, how can you beat this? Because, I mean, it looks so great. Like, this has to be the peak of the comic. But then you have acid rain and mutant attacks and lava lanches. It just
lightning strikes and geysers. And yeah.
And then, of course, there's the trouble within the Radwagon convoy as well. Like you get all these people together, 111 people, which don't remain 111 for long. But you get all these people together and everyone has a different motivation of why they want to leave Mega City 1. And some of them, of course, are going to end up turning on each other. And there's the obvious people who are going to turn on each other. But then there's kind of like the surprise small betrayals throughout the comic as well, that I found really satisfying.
There's some strange choices in who's on the train that you think to start with. So one of the best like mini twists towards the end is there's a group of characters who are a traveling group of acrobats who are like, well, you know what the new world's going to need? If they need anything, they're going to need a family of traveling acrobats to keep them entertained once they all arrive. So their whole thing is, you don't need food, you don't need shelter, you don't need people who can mine or do that sort of thing. You need acrobats. And they get introduced, and you think that's a very silly thing. Maybe they'll do some acrobatics later. And they don't really. Instead, they're just there to betray the main group and abandon them.
Yeah, but there is a moment where they do bring their skills into effect when they have to bring the Radwagon over like the cliff edge. And one of them doesn't use enough cables, and because they don't attach the cables properly, yes, some more members of the convoy go away. And that was one of those moments where I was laughing. I was like, these guys are not the Graysons, because
this is, you can see as well with this in the collection that you've got, it does tell you when it's breaking in the 2000 AD way. So there's the 5 or 6 pages a break, then 5 or 6 pages that came the next week. And the cliffhanger is the cable car is about to, the car is about to collapse back onto the people and crush them. It's like, oh no, how are they going to escape? And then you get to the next week's issue, and it's like, they get crushed. They don't escape. The cliffhanger is they just die.
Well, the funniest one of those cliffhangers, and I don't want to spoil this too much, but there is a geyser death towards the end of the book where you get like some relief and you're like, oh, everything's going to be okay. And then no, everything's not okay.
It's in the worst way. What I really like about this is how there are hundreds odd people in this comic, and they don't try and introduce everyone at the start. You get maybe 4 or 5 names, and then people die off, and then they introduce new people. So throughout the course of the entire book, you're getting this continual reset of like you've got 2 or 3 main characters, but then it's like this Radwagon is now the one that we're going to focus on, or this one's the one we're going to focus on. So you get these little mini stories every single time, which means that it's always feeling fresh. It doesn't feel like you're not following one story from one coast to the other. You're following one story from this set of cliffs over to that set of cliffs. So it increases the danger of the comic because you think, right, well, these people, they're going to be our main protagonists now for the rest of the story. And then they're dead in 5 pages. And a new set of protagonists come in. And then they die. And a new set come in. It's continually resetting, which I did not expect. I thought it would be, a few people at the start and you just follow them through the entire journey. But the way it just keeps reinventing itself is, I suppose, classic 2000 AD, but it just keeps the story so inventive.
It reminded me a little bit of Lost. You have like the 4 people on the plane on United or Oceanic Air. Oh gosh, I can't remember. Whatever that flight number is, you have those people on the plane. You have the core people, Jack and the gang. But then periodically you would have especially towards the end of the season, you'd be introduced to other people who were on the plane. And I don't think that show did that structure right. This does. The reveals and the twists and turns for minor characters in the beginning becoming kind of major characters in their one little story that they get, their one little chapter in this book. Suddenly, like, I care so much about this person who was nobody, 10 days prior to when they initially left Mega City 1. I thought it was extremely clever, and it really highlights the economic skill of Wagner and Grant. Yeah.
As writers, they are, individually exceptional, but as a duo, I just don't think there's anyone who matches them. The level of detail they go into with their characters, who are unusual, unpredictable, untrustworthy in lots of cases, and then unalive within a few pages. I was trying to do another I couldn't think of another but the journey they each go through, the characters, some of them come up and they're just very silly characters, but they still feel like they're people,
Totally, absolutely.
There's one couple who spend the entire time, and they make it across from coast to coast. I won't say if they make it all the way, but they make it across coast to coast. You know what I'm going to say? And their child is maybe not what you might expect.
Yeah, I really don't want to spoil this, but I would like to get your take on why you think the story kind of ends with them. It's an interesting note to end the entire saga of the Helltrekkers, not with Rudd, but with this couple.
Yes, the Tuttles, I think they are. And their daughter, whose name is Crustacea, not to give away what's going on with Crustacea or Crustacea's unique deal in the world. It's such a strange, light way of finishing things. So there's the convoy is trying to make its journey from one coast to the other, and most of the people are dead by the time they get to the end. Crustacea and her parents spend a bit of time in the last few pages of the comic. Potentially they've made it to the end, potentially they've not made it to the end. Who knows what happens? But Crustacea swims away, and her dad is in the last panel, I think, which is him literally trying to coax his daughter back to him by sticking his face underwater and blowing bubbles to her, to like, come, please get me, come find me. And she doesn't. She's gone on for a better world of her own. She's gone for her own journey through the cursed earth. It's such a curious way of finishing the story. And you've challenged me to think of why they did it. I'm struggling to work out what the point was of it.
Like, for me, of course I asked the question because I want to answer it. That's the type of person I am. Like for me, it represents everything that 2000 AD does well, where it is tremendously sad for certain people, like certain people who populate those panels, but it is also extremely funny. It's for the dark-hearted reading, which is me. So I got a big laugh out of it, but behind that laugh, it's a laugh where you're crying, right? I'm laughing and I'm crying, and it just encompasses every emotion. And it was a true surprise, which I thought was exceptional, considering there were many, many moments like that throughout the Helltrekkers. And I just thought this was like, the ultimate rim shot.
By the time you get to the end, you've had such a long journey through the curve with the characters. This ran from Prague 387 till Prague 415, so it ran for like 30 weeks or so, something like that. It's a long journey with them, and to end with a joke feels so classically Wagner and Grant. There's so many Dredd stories that do the exact same thing, where he will go through the worst traumas and he'll do the worst things you can imagine, and at the end there's a silly pun or a joke or something. It reminds me of at the Mills story where Rico returns, Judge Dredd's brother, for the first time, and Dredd's brother returns from being off planet as a convict, comes back, is shown to be a dirty cop, gets killed, and dies in Dredd's arms within about 6 pages, and it ends with a joke. And it's just, this was such a massive change in Dredd's world, and it's all to set up a joke, and then it's just swept away and forgotten about essentially for a long time. And the same with Helltrekkers,
Yeah. Very effective. And also, like, I don't think we can finish this conversation without talking about how great this book looks. The line art is exceptional. The character acting is great. When it does need to be funny, they pull off the comedy. It's just a fantastic looking book. And I read some of it digitally last night because I was drifting off to sleep, and sometimes I need brightness to keep me awake. So I switched over, and digitally it looks fine, but the book, the physical copy, it's top tier cartooning, illustrating.
Very much in the kind of the European style as well. You can see that influence come through. This is of a piece with the work that Esquire was doing in the main Dredd around the same time. And I think,
and there's no cheating, just like most 2000 AD comics of this era. There's no cheating. The backgrounds are great. The vehicles look phenomenal. The detail on the animal biology is amazing. Nothing looks rushed. Yeah.
Even as you go towards the end, and you think at this point the artist must be exhausted, but they're still going to the level of detail. The geyser looks as impressive as the dinosaurs did right at the start. And if anything, I think the character work gets stronger. The facial expressions of the characters as you get towards the end. There's some really strong moments with Lucas Rudd, the main character, which maybe at the start of the series the artists weren't as good at showing, but at the end they've really nailed all of those details. It's a real crash course in how to do this.
Yeah, and honestly, when the book began and we were reading from the journal of Rudd, I was a little disappointed with he's kind of like a boring character to be your gateway into the book. But the way that the trek changes him makes him a much more compelling character. And the torment he experiences is, metaphorically satisfying.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and that's because they keep a lot of the twists right in the pocket for towards the end. There's a lot of things that are going to happen at some point. This carriage is going to betray people. These people are going to be sinister in some way, but they don't pull that trigger until you get right towards the end. Is it the Neb family? The troublemakers. They're in one of the red wagons, and they're. Every chance they get, they try and stab you in the back or betray you or cause trouble, hurt the locals, that sort of thing. And that doesn't get culminated until right towards maybe the second to last story.
Yeah. And then the empathy that the story gives to one of those members of the family, yeah, the final panels of their ending in this story were a shock to me.
Yeah, yeah, and so effectively done, because what we've had as a narrative structure throughout the story is every chapter starts with an excerpt from Rudd's diary, where it's like, this week, 2 people will die, or this week, this person will die particularly. It kind of tells you what's going to happen. But over time, that becomes more and more vague. And he gets to the point where I don't think he's got a diary entry in the next story. He's just got the Neb family threaten, this is going to happen to you next. And that's what happens to them next instead. It swaps out the narrative, which is a really clever way of doing it. But again, it's like, that's Wagner and Grant thing, I suppose, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, and the story is only like what, 16 days? It's not the saga that I was imagining. And early on when I was reading it, I was a little worried about that. I was like, oh, day 1. And, we've lost 5 people. What's day 100 going to be? I just assumed we were going to be on the road for a very, very long time. But these are rad wagons, and they can cross a lot of terrain pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah. One thing that's interesting I wanted to ask you about in particular is around this time in the 80s, there was a disconnect between British comics and American comics. So American comics, I believe, was still being ruled over by the by what's it called, the Comics Code Authority and their ruling for things. Whereas in Britain, you were getting these comics where people are getting eaten by dinosaurs, they're getting zapped by lightning, children are getting killed off in the story, which is really unexpected. From your perspective, were you kind of shocked by the levels of detail this went into with the deaths and the gore and the anyone can die aspect of it?
So I was reading it and I didn't stop to see when the publication date was. It wasn't until I had finished that I flipped over to the copyright page and I saw that it was 1983. And I was surprised at its publication date. Because we were definitely not getting comics like this at that point in time. And, like, to me, this feels like this isn't even right, but like content wise, it's kind of like early aughts American comics. And they were already like, you just couldn't imagine this story coming out of Marvel or DC in the 80s. And even in like the 90s, you would definitely not, you can't really see anything like that. And even when Marvel would bring in the Max line, it's not quite like this. You look at like the Punisher stories and Werewolf by Night Max stories of the aughts. The maturity isn't quite like what you have here. Independent comics, obviously, in the black and white boom in America, you had some really extreme stuff going on. I was a proud reader of Faust once upon a time. And that goes places that this book doesn't. But yeah, I was definitely taken aback by when this book was published.
Yeah, and still though, reading it today, I could go, this is the sort of thing where it's a little dated. There are some particular sections which are really dated
but not that dated. Not that dated.
But not that dated. You can read it now, and like we both read it for the first time this year, and we both read it and went, this is something that could come out now. Like it's just like an updated version of the Poseidon Adventure or the Towering Inferno, these sort of disaster movies where things escalate. It's just the disaster is a country rather than a location, rather than a building. Or a vehicle. For
me, give me a comic from Marvel 1983, give me like a Fantastic Four and Avengers comic. And if I'm going to read that now, I have to really go like, okay, I'm putting myself in the context of Marvel 1983 to enjoy it, right?
Yeah.
And you have to do that often with a lot of movies as well. This, I didn't really have to, fall into any era. I just devoured it as if it was coming off the stand today, and I enjoyed it as much as I would anything else that I read this year.
Oh, that's so good to hear. It's so nice to hear that, isn't it? Because this is the thing for myself that I'm learning and talking to people like yourself as well, where 2018 has got all these books all these comics that came out that you may not have heard of. The Helltrekkers is not Judge Dredd, it's not Rogue Trooper, it's not the name thing, but you see it on the shelf, it looks interesting, you read it and you go, this is an entire world in itself that I had no idea was out there.
Yeah. And find me a book that looks this good right now.
Yeah.
There aren't many.
It's incredible. I mean, around this time you've got Rogue Trooper, Judge Dredd. I mean, the art style, this reminds me of the work done in. Have you read Shaco at all?
I have not, but I do have a copy.
Have a look at that next, because I think if you like the Helltrekkers, Shaco is a bit like that.
Oh yeah, I flipped through it. It looks awesome.
Yeah, except the protagonist is more likable because it's a bear. Would you rather spend 12 days in the cursed earth with a bear or with a man? That's the question I suppose we have to ask. And Helltrekkers, I think, gives us the answer on that one. Shaco would not have had quite as many casualties, perhaps, if he'd been in charge of the convoy. I mean, there's so much to talk about with Helltrekkers. I'm just trying to scan it back in my head, because it feels like the passage of time really passes in this story. Like, the people they are at the start are not the people they are by the time you get to the end. One thing that one note I really enjoyed about this, which I always like with dystopian futures, is whenever they reference where they are, there's always some description of like, and this is a disaster. Like, hey, we've made it to Wisconsin. Oh no, we're in Wisconsin now. This is what happened to Wisconsin. Like,
yeah, I love the map, right? Like the map that starts the chapters, where you get to see where they are on their trek away from Mega City 1, and getting to the stinking creek, and Sauron Valley, of course, where the dinosaurs are. I love a good map, and I love the other element of the Helltrekkers that's extremely effective is the countdown clock of 111 members, right? Mm-hmm. So the constant decrease of that number creates an urgency to this story that you don't normally see in something like this.
Yeah. And here's a spoiler warning for everyone. So spoiler alert here. The spoiler for this one is that people survive, because I did not see that coming. I thought they would all be dead by the end.
I thought Rudd was gone halfway through. Like I thought, it would become his son's story, or it would become Banjo Quint's story, or somebody else. And
someone tougher and meaner and less.
Yeah. And the shock is that Rudd survives, but in surviving, he's also dying emotionally inside, and really struggling to get these people to safety. And with each loss, he feels it tremendously, and you, the reader, feel it tremendously through his experience.
Yeah, absolutely. So you really, by the time you get to the end, you're really invested in him. Like the rest of the convoy have had their stories. They've all killed or whatever's happened to them. By that point, there's maybe 10 left, I think. And you don't remember many of them who survives, but you remember him because he just leaves such an impression by the end of, he's not just this bland white meat sort of hero. He has got these layers to him. He's gone through this stuff and he's changed. And you can see the evolution in him.
Yeah, we haven't said these two words yet, but by the end, I was thinking a little bit of Mad Max, especially as how Max is portrayed in Fury Road. Like you could see Rudd continue on, and the Rudd in the sequel to the Helltrekkers would be very different than any of the Rudds you see over the course of this.
His wife says, "Oh no, you forgot to lock the house before we left." So he goes back across the cursed earth again, and that's the sequel.
Absolutely.
Maybe that's what we need to have a word with Farg about that one. There's a pitch I've just made. This is one of these stories where I've got to ask this of you, Brad, because we do need to come to our time in a moment. But what haven't we talked about? Is there anything else we haven't touched? Because there's so much in this.
I mean, there's a lot going on with the book. I feel like we covered the elements that I enjoyed the most. Was there anything else?
I gotta say, it was nice that there was actually a promised land as well. Now we're in spoiler territory, because that was the other thing. I had two thoughts in my head. One was they're all going to die, and the second one was they're going to arrive at somewhere which is worse than Mega City 1. And
it very well might be, though. We don't see much of the new territories once they get there. like like the Chinese shop opens up, the Radwagon mobile Chinese restaurant opens up. We get a church, but I imagine if we were to hang out with these characters, none of them are going to have the sunset ending, the happily ever after Walt Disney ending. I think just the last thing I would really want to reiterate is how fast this comic reads. I had to find myself needing to slow down because I was starting to race through it, and I think that is again because of the countdown clock of okay, another one gone. But yeah, I read this so quickly, and it was just a delight.
And I'm so glad to hear that you enjoyed it, and I'm really glad that you suggested this one as one for us to talk about, because it's one that doesn't get talked about as often, but it's a strong entry in 2000 AD. It's a nice additional thing. It says a few things about 2000 AD and Judge Dredd, whilst being entirely its own thing. So it's a nice little part of our foundation, I would say. Yeah, for sure.
If you wanted to sell somebody on what's wrong with Mega City 1, give them the Helltrekkers. The Helltrekkers will tell you what's wrong with Mega City 1. These people wanted out, and this was a sweeter reward than living within those walls.
Absolutely. Brad, thank you so much for coming on to talk about Helltrekkers. Really enjoyed hearing from you on this one. A really nice conversation, I think. But if people have been listening to you and they're going, Brad, he sounds like a great podcaster, much better than Steve. Where can we find you online? What are you up to, and where can we find you?
Well, first off, it's been a pleasure to be on this podcast as a longtime 2000 AD fanatic. It's more than a pleasure; it's an honor. So, thank you, Steve, for having me on. If I have not bored you too much listening to me drone on, and you would like to hear more of this lovely voice, you can find me at comicbookcouplescounselling.com. That's the podcast that I do with my lovely wife Lisa, who's also been on the 2000 AD podcast. And what we do on that show is we take couples and we pair them, comic book couples. We take comic book couples like Scott Summers and Jean Grey, and we pair them with real world self-help books, problematic self-help books like The 5 Love Languages. And in the analysis of using that self-help book to that comic book couple, we learn a little bit more about our own relationship. We also talk to some incredible creators, some 2000 AD creators that we've had on the show. We've had Rob Williams talking about Judge Dredd, End of Days. We had Alex DeCampi on the show talking about Full Tilt Boogie. Mm-hmm. Our latest episode is with Maria Bamford and Scott Marvel Cassidy talking about Hog Book and Laser Eyes from Fantagraphics, and that was a really wonderful conversation. So,
I am so excited to hear that one.
It's so good. It's so good. Dream come true, chat.
Yeah, and you've had all of the big names in comics are coming your way quite rightly now, because you're so entertaining as hosts, and you're such good interviewers and interviewees as well. So yeah, I really recommend that the podcast to anyone listening to this one. If you enjoy deep dives into comics, then Comic Book Couples Counselling is going to be something for you, I think. Yeah, but brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Brad, again for coming on the pod, and we'll hopefully talk to you again soon at some point.
Absolutely, anytime.
Wow.